The business community awaiting the announcement of the new cabinet, especially the portfolios like the economic cluster. It remains to be seen if economic minister, or should we say the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, will be retained in that post. Let's discuss this now, and we're joined by the University of Cape Town Public Policy Senior Lecturer, Raenette Gottardo, and we are also joined by University of Johannesburg economist, Professor Miriam Altman. To both of you, thank you very much for making time for this discussion. Let me start with you, Ms. Gottardo. And the public is waiting with anticipation as to when this cabinet is going to finally be announced. Should we be worried because the word, or the minute the word uncertainty starts being used, that then sends shockwaves into the business community? What should we read into this?
Just a quick correction. It's Dr. Gottardo, and I'm an independent consultant. I am not with UCT. I just think that the crucial issue here is to understand that we are in unprecedented territory, and sometimes unprecedented territory does take time. Mindful of that, as we all also know from experience, markets do not always give you the benefit of time. So the urgency of making an announcement has to be balanced against the complexity of what is on the table. What is on the table is a complex new arrangement, which is GNU, which is very different to the GNU of the early 90s. And a very different context of negotiations where a ruling party has effectively lost power and is now in a new governing arrangement with a host of new partners. The dynamic of cabinet composition is therefore inevitably different and inevitably the product of a very complex negotiation with an increasingly leftward trending opposition that can both leverage interparliamentary, in-parliament means and extra-parliamentary. So the varied factors on the table are indeed complex and not easy to navigate through, but uncertainty is never a good thing.
Yeah. Let's come to you, Professor Altman, and let's talk about the Minister of Finance role. How important, or how much importance do the markets and indeed investors attach to the role of this person?
Well, that job in particular is really critical, and because it governs the most important resource allocation process in the country. So having stability in that particular role matters a lot. I'm going to take you back, though, to the mid-90s when Trevor Manuel took on this idea of, who are these markets? What is that, right? Because nobody believed in him, if you remember, that he was I think he followed Derek Keyes, if I remember.
Yes.
And and so there was a question as to whether he could do that job. And as it turns out, he was a very good finance minister and was there for many years. I think there's a feeling that Enoch Godongwana may continue. Hard to say, but stability in that role is key of all of them.
Would it matter, still with you, Professor Altman, would it matter if that person is drawn from the political establishment of the day or is drawn from outside? There has been this talk of the president going outside to find a fresh Minister of Finance.
I don't think that's the key issue. The key issue is whether that person can navigate the politics, that they have resonance in markets, that they have an understanding of finance, that they know they can navigate the markets and they can navigate the politics, that they have those set of capabilities, that they understand the budget process and the variety of activities and the character of what that job is about.
Yeah.
That's what would matter.
Dr. Gottardo, let's come back to you. The reorganizing of cabinet, and there has been much talk, as you would have heard, for example, on this channel today, one of the political parties in parliament saying that the role of deputy ministers is simply that of driving patronage. These people are of no use. How should that be done, the reorganizing of cabinet?
You know, I think that we all have to remember that the reorganization of cabinet is a presidential prerogative. And that has always been the case through the presidencies of Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe, Cyril Ramaphosa, Jacob Zuma. There's always been an imprint given to cabinet by the reigning president. The circumstances this time around are very different. And I think that is something that has to be borne in mind. It constrains the choices to dramatically alter cabinet to an extent, but it also doesn't do so completely. This remains a presidential prerogative, but as I said, in complex new circumstances where negotiation is the order of the day, and that negotiation cannot be uncomplicated. And even though one would have to be mindful of all the different consequences of the rearrangement of cabinet, one has to accommodate a variety of partners now. And if we look at some of the reports today of the kind of gamesmanship that appears to be at play in these negotiations, I think it's important for all political parties to remember that the electorate sent a fairly strong message about the kind of politics and the tonality that it wishes to see from our politicians, and the focus that it wishes to see on really ameliorating the living circumstances of the majority of South Africans. And that is the terrain of economic policy. And that does require a complex set of skills that are not always found in the same person, but that person is often buttressed by a very sophisticated team.
Yeah.
So we have the beauty of having a very sophisticated team in the National Treasury and in the Reserve Bank, and people are buttressed by their teams.
Dr. Gottardo, let me stay with you for just one moment. You mentioned the politics of the day, and of course the news reports coming out suggesting that there is haggling over who should have what. Do you think, though, that the DA has a point when they refuse flat out to be given only 3 ministries, because their argument seems to hinge around whether or not they are going to play a meaningful and effective role in this cabinet with only 3 ministers?
I think one has to look at it from the perspective of the political party concerned, and I haven't looked at or dealt with DA matters for probably in excess of 20 years. But in my capacity as an independent political analyst, what I know all political parties think about is their future path. And what is at stake for the DA here is a very complex balancing act between its future path with GNU background and experience, or a continuation of its existing trajectory of opposition politics, which it is now effectively, negated by going into the GNU arrangement. So the ground underneath the feet of all the political parties is shifting as we speak. We have an alignment of a more leftward, as I indicated, opposition that can choose both parliamentary means and extra-parliamentary means to lobby in terms of what it sees as the positions of a new GNU. So the math that the DA has to make in this circumstance is quite complicated. They have very complicated decisions to make about what would be good enough, and they would have to do so in the context of a GNU that has expanded in size beyond the original agreement that they agreed to.
Let's come to you, Professor Altman, and we're now talking driving economic growth and development within this economic cluster of ministers. We've already spoken about the finance ministry. Which other ministry, which other portfolio becomes very important to decide on, particularly as it pertains to driving growth?
Well, let's remember something first. I'd like to speak truth to power, truth to the anchor, which is that, firstly, anybody who's in a role, be it a deputy minister or anything else that's getting paid and is appointed, should be taking their job very seriously. And none of these jobs, some of them may have become sort of redundant and patronage positions, but anyone who's in those roles should actually be held to account to be doing their job, as maybe a David Masondo has been doing. Maybe the Deputy Minister of Finance is a good example where there actually have been real roles.
Yeah.
And the reality also is that we mustn't just be thinking economic or social. Let's take one example. The PA want to have home affairs. And they say, we want that because we want to get rid of illegal migrants. It tells me that, well, one of the positive things is, say they did get home affairs, they would find out that there's a system of government they have to run. And that's a very small part of what they do. Home Affairs has a monopoly on the issuing of IDs and passports. That's actually its core function. And they're going to have to find that they're going to have to improve the services to all citizens and all people. There's a whole probably 20 years of clearance where we've got to deal with normalization, particularly of Zimbabweans, where we're trying to throw them out, but actually they're here partly because of our foreign policy, which has been a bit disappointing in relation to Zimbabwe. So there's a whole range of complex things that matter a great deal. Then there's the whole issue of issuing of visas to tourists and business visas, which is absolutely critical to growth. And of course, the protection of borders. But, you know, to be quite frank, that's probably the smallest part of what they'd have to think about. That if they did get that, they'd find out. And, you know, that could be a good thing. To be honest, that may be true for the DA as well. I think the DA is coming in thinking they know how to govern, but actually they don't particularly, maybe in the Western Cape for sure. But the kinds of departments they want, shall I stop there?
Yeah, please continue.
They were wanting, just as an example, DPSA, Department of Public Service and Administration. Now, they may not realize what they're asking for. That's pretty critical also to the economy. That's where services get delivered around, say, the police, nurses, doctors, teachers. They set the norms. Now, we haven't had proper negotiation or strategy building around the public service, which, by the way, is about a third of the budget. So it's it's gone out of control because the negotiation and management of it has not had a grip since the late 90s. There's very poor negotiation. There's virtually no strategy around remuneration, performance, right job, right skill, right job, all that kind of thing. I don't think they're probably going in there thinking, oh, we're going to manage this bloated public service. And they probably don't realize there's a whole system of government that's got to be put right if we want to start seeing the most basic kinds of staff motivation amongst the public service and some control over kind of runaway remuneration. So what I would love to see is whoever gets into these roles, that they actually apply their mind, because we haven't seen that for quite a while, that they actually apply their mind to the system of government and the basic bureaucratic functions that they need to deliver so that we can see effective service delivery. It's not a creative exercise.
Very interesting indeed. Dr. Gottardo, let's come back to you. And it's an interesting point, is it not, that Professor Altman makes, that if the DA is thinking that they're going to use the same sort of script they've always used for how they govern the Western Cape, and they think that coming into a cabinet minister post, they will likely be able to replicate that, they may find that very, very difficult. Do you agree with that point?
Again, having left DA politics and policy behind, I will not hold a candle or speak for in DA politics or policy. So putting me on the spot, I will put you back on the spot with that statement, and also indicate that as a political scientist, the most crucial thing that any incoming new member of a cabinet, regardless of its political party or its origin, would have to bear in mind would be to get a proper handover report from its predecessor administration, because that handover report, which would have to be detailed on every aspect of policy implementation, policy failure, procurement history, rigidly detailed on every single element, would have to give that new member of cabinet a proper insight into what they're inheriting. And I think we also have to realize that that will flag, and it will also create very clear distinctions where the ideological differences are going to emerge. A government of national unity is going to have to work through those big ideological differences that may be around the table on an issue-by-issue basis, on a department-by-department basis, and this is going to be where all the challenges are going to come. And this is where all the issues from the original government of national unity came unstuck. I mean, I have the very vivid memory of attending the very first press conference I attended in Parliament in the early 90s, when then Deputy President F.W. de Klerk had taken the then New National Party out of the Government of National Unity. And he did so by virtue of some of these ideological differences and how they were impossible to massage within a GNU context. So that history will also be important in understanding how pivotably important it will be to work through those ideological differences as and when they emerge, to try and craft that consensus area that may or may not be possible, and to work through those handover reports to understand what will be at stake. And that will be irrespective whether you're going to be a DA MP who's going to come into a cabinet role, or a Rise Mzansi MP or a UDM MP. Anyone who has sat on opposition benches and not sat in government is going to need a fair amount of handover report conversation with an outgoing minister and his or her team, and a proper understanding of where the ideological differences are going to emerge, and crucially, what the deadlock breaking mechanisms are going to have to look like to get people over those hurdles, because this is going to be an ongoing process.
If you're just joining us, we are in the middle of a discussion about the economic cluster of ministries and how this translates ultimately into job creation, or has to at some point. And joining me for this discussion, we are still with independent consultant Dr. Raenette Gottardo, and we are also joined by University of Johannesburg economist Professor Miriam Altman. Professor Altman, I want to pick up with you. Industrial policy and trade. Help us understand how this translates into job creation at the end of the day? Or is that too simplistic a view?
Well, the most important thing going on right now, because of where we are in the country, is the reform of infrastructure industries, really, at this point. It shouldn't be, but that's where we are right now as a country. So the challenges around getting goods around the country efficiently to export markets, the load shedding we've experienced, which, that's calmed down recently, but the load shedding over the past period of years has been extremely destructive. The challenges around commuter transport are absolutely devastating when so many people live far from where economic opportunity is. The municipal turn is so there's been in the past 6 months quite a lot of effort to reform SOEs, which are effectively, in many cases, monopolies. So to open them up, enable new players to come in, new forms of procurement, certainly in energy and water, that's underway. That's a sector I'm personally working in right now. In freight transport, as you know, there's been a process of strengthening the leadership in Transnet, as has happened in Eskom, and in introducing private participation in the operation of ports and hopefully some of the rail lines. And there's a whole process in Treasury to be driving municipal turnarounds in these kinds of municipal services like energy, water, these kinds of areas. Those are absolutely critical. They're pretty foundational and they're in a very bad state, so they become pretty critical to job creation and growth. In terms of industrial policy itself, I think the critical change that really needs to happen is that we have to get to be thinking about industrial growth more dynamically. We tend to have a very protective, very static way of thinking about opportunity instead of job creating. So, just as basic as, in the next period, we've really got to get moving with the mining permits, just as the most basic thing, much less a whole range of industrial promotion activities, which again are generating growth, new activity, rather than how you carve up the pie.
Let's come to you, Dr. Gottardo. Let's talk about Operation Vulindlela. Professor Altman talks about the reforms, the structural reforms, whether you talk freight, you talk energy, ICT, water. We know that some of this is being unlocked within that project management office, if you like, and that's what I like to call Operation Vulindlela. How well have they done as a structure to try and undo the logjam that is. There was even a man who was appointed to undo this. The red tape, the red tape person that was appointed to that particular role, but I don't think that they are there anymore. Operation Vulindlela, how well has it done, or is it still work in progress in your view?
I think, to be fair, one would only have to say that it is work in progress. And I think, just to also dwell on what Professor Altman has highlighted, the reality here is that we're talking about the basics of water and electricity when we should be talking about how rapidly can we emerge into the new era of artificial intelligence. I mean, we seem to be not rushing fast enough to make our economy competitive enough to reach into the modern era. We need to move much faster on unlocking the bottlenecks in infrastructure and logistics that were functional prior to the state capture era and are now in a very problematic space, in order to be ready for the absolute opportunity which is represented by artificial intelligence and the modern era that is upon us. We've done a lot of work in South Africa through the work of Professor Marwala at UJ on the fourth industrial revolution, but we can't get there if we don't fix all the bottlenecks. So work in progress is a mild description for where we need to be on Vulindlela, let alone to reach into the fourth industrial revolution much more actively and aggressively.
Sure. Professor Altman, Directors General and their role within the capacity of the state. What is your prognosis of the capacity of the state right now?
Not strong. Certainly not where it needs to be. I want to come back to what Dr. Gottardo was saying. Is Operation Vulindlela has been a real game changer, and so incredibly important. The most important thing, however, and it should continue, it's been incredibly important. But the most important thing that has to happen is that people need to be appointed who have the right skills and capability, and they need to be in full-time roles. There are far too many DGs who are in acting roles, and far too many leaders of state-owned enterprise and various other parts of government that are in acting roles. It's pretty incredible. So I think I would stand to be corrected, but I'm guessing there probably aren't more than 2 or 3 DGs right now. I may be wrong about that, but it's not more than a handful of DGs who are in permanent positions. I think that's, when I say permanent, I think that's 5-year contracts is really what I mean. They're not acting. It's very hard to deliver when you're acting. So it's probably Duncan Peterson, Treasury, I believe, Sean Phillips in Water and Sanitation, both excellent DGs, I have to say, and in permanent roles. It doesn't mean they're there for life, but I mean properly appointed. I don't know who else there is. There may be others, but Phil Mjara potentially, but he's a long-standing bureaucrat in science and technology and higher education. I'm not sure if there's more. So critically, as I was saying, we need to run a government like a proper bureaucracy. People need to be appointed according to whether it's the leadership of municipalities, the principals of schools, director generals, and the executive of departments need to be stable. They need to be appointed according to their capability and skill, and they need to be able to, be performance managed, both positive and negative. In other words, that they are held to account for the jobs they do and rewarded when they do well and sanctioned when they don't. And that is probably one of the biggest gaps currently in the operation of the state currently.
Dr. Gottardo, are the public servants, are they properly performance managed, as Professor Altman alludes to?
I think Professor Altman put her finger on the nub of the issue. It's not performance management in the sense that, we've had a lot of change in these roles. Those changes have been associated with changes in government, changes in ministers. When we change ministers, we change DGs. And that's not necessarily the kind of performance management you want. You want people who know that they have security of tenure, not for life, but who know that they are there for a longitudinal period that exceeds 5 years, and that they have some scope and room to move to implement longer term projects. So there has to be a balance between ministers wanting their trusted confidants in these roles. Sometimes there are political appointees, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, but we're going to require different lenses in the sense that we're going to need to have people in roles that require longitudinal data, longitudinal timeframes to get through important longer term projects. And sometimes the ebb and flow of how politics pans out doesn't always facilitate this. And then you get the kind of performance management that doesn't look at KPIs and doesn't look at security of tenure. So this is exactly where a lot of focus and attention has to go in. And hopefully that, in the context of a GNU, where people are also going to be negotiating some of these contracts, that they'll bear that in mind.
Yeah. All right. We're wrapping this up now. Professor Altman, 2 quick areas of concern, and that have been in the public space for some time. The management of the energy crisis, and you couple that with freight rail and public transport. How well do you think we have done on that score in terms of just managing the crisis? Because these are almost the albatross around how well or poorly the economy is going to function.
So, I think you've answered your question. It's been an albatross, and the metrics are there, and it's very well known. It's not my opinion, it's just fact that there's been institutional decline, and that's a problem when the state is a monopoly in some critical areas like energy provision and electricity and freight rail, or freight, or commuter rail, where only the state operates those kinds of functions. So it becomes very important either to fix the institution of delivery and or have other channels for delivery. And given that there's so much technology change right now, there's almost no logic anymore for having single providers in most areas. There's very little logic. The question is, what are the areas where the state really needs to function, where there's a natural monopoly? But most areas are not like that anymore. There's multiple technologies, lots of innovation, lots of players, and we need to get better at engaging with these kinds of players. That's very much the National Infrastructure Plan 2050 that I put together for government very much focuses on those things, but it requires a huge culture change. And and that issue of having stable, capable management, some people in the private sector have this view that the private sector can just take over, but physically it's just impossible, because if the state is running something as a monopoly, the private sector physically can't do that. You need capability, even just about regulation and the changing rules and procurement and serving in the public interest. There's, these long-standing, as Dr. Gottardo was saying, these capabilities where people learn their jobs and they learn the routines and they have the relationships over time and they can breathe and are performance managed, but actually know their jobs because they were there for maybe 10 years or et cetera. We really have to start getting back to these basics. If somebody calls me yet again after 30 years and said, we need a growth plan, I think I'm going to scream. What we need right now, it's so basic, really. It's going to be very hard to do. But what we need is a properly functioning bureaucracy and a capability to partner with private actors and with civil society. And I'm just saying it's not simple, but that's what I'm doing in the water space right now. We're bringing partnerships around for Sean Phillips, actually. In Gauteng, we're bringing the private sector, public sector, civil society together in Gauteng. We just launched on Tuesday, actually, to look at water security. That's the kind of thing that needs to happen, but it's not rocket science. It's actually just talking to each other and having building relationships and working together in a positive dynamic.
All right.
It's not creative.
Dr. Gottardo, you get to have the final thoughts as well. Professor Altman prompted my last question, water security, and you couple that with the security of the nation. I'm talking the criminal justice element. How much of a culture change are we going to need in that regard?
Well, I think there will be a need for a culture change that stretches across these areas, whether it's the two you highlight or whether it's the economic area. We're going to have to avoid all red herring words. You know, we're going to have to focus on, if people talk about privatization in this very blindly ideological way, or any of these topics on a blindly ideological form, we're going to have challenges. We're going to need creative partnerships between business and government. They've done it once before during COVID. They did it in a fairly powerful way. They can continue to do so, and they will have to do so. They will have to do so in all the areas that we've touched on, whether it's economics, water security, or criminal justice reform and skill sets and issues in relation to training in forensics and all these issues. We need a completely different tonality to all these conversations. And it is a tonality where the private sector has to start understanding some of the complex dynamics of what governance means, and vice versa. Those in government will have to have a greater sensitivity and sensibility around the constraints that also inform the business environment. And that has to be a respectful conversation on both sides. And that will imply a greater form of trust. It will imply a greater form of mutual respect to what we've seen in the past 30 years. And that will be complicated to navigate, but it is absolutely crucial.
Dr. Raenette Gottardo is an independent consultant. Thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion. And alongside her is University of Johannesburg economist, Professor Miriam Altman.